The river claimed her before anyone could shout a warning, the churning brown water of the Rio Grande swallowing Ruby Ford whole as her boot caught between two rocks and pulled her down into the merciless current that had already drowned 3 men that spring of 1878. Kade Lancaster saw it happen from 50 yards upstream, where he'd been watering his sorrel mare, watching the young woman trying to cross at the worst possible point, the deepest channel where the snowmelt from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains turned the usually calm river into a raging torrent. He didn't think, didn't hesitate, didn't even drop the reins properly before he was running full speed toward the bank, his boots pounding against the rocky shore, his heart hammering against his ribs because he could see her red hair fanning out beneath the surface like blood in the water. She was already under when he hit the water like a bullet, the cold shocking his system as he dove deep, fought the current for her with every ounce of strength in his body. The river tried to take him too, tried to dash him against the rocks that lined the bottom, but Kade had grown up on these waters, had swum in the Rio Grande since he was old enough to walk, and he knew how to read the currents, how to use them instead of fighting them entirely. His lungs burned as he pushed deeper, his eyes stinging from the silt, and then he saw her, saw those white fingers still clawing at the rocks that held her fast, saw the way her dress billowed around her like a ghost, and he grabbed her around the waist with one arm while his other hand went to work on her trapped boot. The leather was wedged tight, caught in a crevice between 2 stones, and for a horrible moment he thought he wouldn't be able to free her, thought they'd both drown right there in the muddy water while the whole world continued on above them, unaware and uncaring. His knife. He still had his knife on his belt, the bone-handled blade his father had given him before yellow fever took him 5 years back. Kade pulled it free, sawed at the leather boot top, his vision starting to dim at the edges, his lungs screaming for air. The current buffeted them both, kept trying to tear her from his grasp, but he held on, kept cutting, and finally the leather gave way and she came free. He kicked hard for the surface, dragging her with him, using the current now instead of fighting it, letting it push them downstream while he angled toward the eastern bank where the water ran shallower. His head broke the surface and he gasped, pulled her face up above the water, but her eyes were closed and her lips were blue and she wasn't breathing. The current carried them another 20 yards before his boots finally found purchase on the rocky bottom, before he could haul them both toward shore, his muscles shaking from exertion and cold. He dragged her up onto the bank, laid her on her side, and started pounding on her back the way old Doc Morrison had shown him once, trying to get the water out of her lungs. Nothing happened. She lay there limp and lifeless, her skin pale as milk, and for a terrible moment Kade thought he'd been too slow, thought he'd failed, thought this beautiful stranger was going to die right there in his arms before he even knew her name. Then she convulsed, coughed up what seemed like half the river, and sucked in a desperate, rattling breath that was the most wonderful sound Kade had ever heard. She coughed again, gasped, her green eyes flying open wide with panic and confusion, and he helped her sit up, kept his hand on her back while she heaved and shook. "Easy now," he said, his own voice rough and breathless. "You're safe. You're on shore. Just breathe." She turned to look at him, really look at him, and even soaked and half drowned and clearly terrified, she was the most striking woman he'd ever seen. Not pretty in the conventional sense, not like the painted ladies in the saloons or the fresh-faced girls at the church socials, but striking, with sharp cheekbones and a generous mouth, and those vivid green eyes that seemed to look right through him. "You jumped in after me," she said, her voice hoarse from the water she'd swallowed. It wasn't a question, just a statement of fact, as if she was still trying to make sense of what had happened. "Yes, madam," Kade said, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, how his arm was still around her shoulders, how she was shivering violently in the cool spring air. Couldn't very well let you drown. I'm not sure I gave you much choice in the matter, she said, and then she laughed, a slightly hysterical sound that turned into more coughing. When she could speak again, she said, Ruby Ford, and I owe you my life, Mr. Lancaster, Kade Lancaster. And you don't owe me anything except a promise that you won't try crossing at that point again. He shrugged out of his vest, wrung it out, and draped it around her shoulders even though it was nearly as wet as she was. What were you doing out here alone anyway? That crossing is dangerous even in low water. Ruby pulled his vest tighter around herself, her teeth chattering. I was trying to get to Stein's Pass. I have a teaching position waiting there, or at least I did. I'm supposed to start on Monday, which means I'm already going to be 3 days late, and now I've lost my boot and half my supplies and probably given myself pneumonia in the bargain. Stein's Pass is 40 miles southwest of here, Kade said, frowning. You're way off course. This is still the Rio Grande, near San Marshal. Were you following the river? I was following what I thought was the main road, but I must have taken a wrong turn yesterday. I camped last night near some cottonwoods, and this morning I thought if I could just cross the river, I'd be able to see the mountains better, get my bearings. She closed her eyes, looking utterly exhausted. I'm from Boston. I've never even seen a river like this before, let alone try to cross one. That was foolish of me. Foolish, but brave, Kade said and meant it. Most people from back east wouldn't last a day out here on their own. You made it almost to San Marshal, which is more than I can say for some. He stood up, offered her his hand. Can you walk? My horse is just upstream and there's a ranch about 2 miles from here. The Hendersons are good people. They'll let you rest and dry out, maybe lend you some clothes and a pair of boots. Ruby took his hand, let him pull her to her feet, but the moment she tried to put weight on her bootless foot, she winced and nearly fell. Kade caught her, steadied her, and saw that her stocking was torn and her ankle was already starting to swell. Twisted it, looks like, he said. When your boot got caught in those rocks, can you stand on it at all? She tried, gritted her teeth, but shook her head. Not really. Maybe if I had something to lean on. Without a word, Kade turned around, crouched down. Climb on. I'll carry you to my horse. You can't be serious. You just pulled me out of a river. You must be exhausted. I'm fine. And you're not walking 2 miles on a twisted ankle in one boot. Now climb on before we both catch our death from cold. Ruby hesitated for just a moment, then wrapped her arms around his neck and let him hoist her up onto his back. She was lighter than he'd expected, or maybe he was still running on the raw energy that came after brushing up against death. Either way, he carried her easily back upstream to where his mare stood waiting, reins trailing in the dirt. Getting Ruby up onto the horse was trickier, but they managed it, and Kade swung up behind her, gathered the reins, and turned the mare toward the Henderson ranch. Ruby sagged back against his chest, still shivering, and he wrapped one arm around her waist to hold her steady while he guided the horse with his other hand. They rode in silence for a while, the sun climbing higher in the sky, beginning to warm them both. Kade was acutely aware of every place their bodies touched, aware of how she fit against him like she'd been made to be there, aware of how her hair smelled like river water and something floral underneath, some soap or perfume from back east. Why did you do it? Ruby asked suddenly, her voice quiet. Jump in after me, I mean. You didn't know me. I could have been anyone. Kade considered the question, considered all the things he could say, all the simple answers he could give. Because it was the right thing to do. Because I couldn't just stand there and watch you drown. Because that's what any decent person would have done. But none of those felt true. Or at least not entirely true, because the truth was he'd seen something in that split second before he dove in. Something in the desperate way she'd been fighting for her life. Something that had called to him in a way he didn't quite understand. "I don't know," he said finally, honestly. "I just knew I had to try." Ruby didn't say anything to that, just nodded against his chest, and they rode on through the desert scrubland, past creosote bushes and yucca plants, until the Henderson ranch came into view. A low adobe house with a barn and several outbuildings, smoke rising from the chimney. Martha Henderson took one look at them, dripping wet and bedraggled, and immediately bustled into action, shooing them inside, building up the fire, pulling out blankets and dry clothes. Her husband Tom was out checking on their cattle, but Martha was more than capable of handling the situation herself, and within 20 minutes, Ruby was wrapped in a quilt by the fire, her ankle propped up and wrapped in cloth soaked in witch hazel, a cup of hot coffee in her hands. Kade had changed into a pair of Tom's old clothes, his own wet things hanging by the fire to dry. He sat across from Ruby, watching her over the rim of his own coffee cup, still not quite believing what had happened in the past hour. "So you're a teacher," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. "What brings you all the way from Boston to New Mexico territory?" Ruby wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, seemed to draw strength from its warmth. "Honestly, I needed to leave. My father wanted me to marry a man I couldn't stand, a banker with more money than sense and hands that wandered where they shouldn't. When I refused, my father said I was being ungrateful, said I'd never get a better offer. So I started looking for teaching positions out west, anywhere far enough away that he couldn't drag me back." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I thought New Mexico sounded exotic, warm, different from everything I'd known." "It's different, all right," Kade said. "Steins Pass is a rough town. Mining town, mostly, with all that comes with it. Saloons and gamblers and men who haven't seen civilization in months. Are you sure you want to be there alone?" "I won't be alone. I'll have my students. And besides, I'm not some delicate flower who needs protecting." "I made it all the way from Boston on my own, didn't I?" She raised an eyebrow at him, challenging. The river notwithstanding, Kade couldn't help but grin. "Fair enough. But Steins Pass is still 40 miles from here, and you're in no condition to travel on that ankle. You should stay here a few days, let it heal." "I can't. I'm already late as it is. They'll give my position to someone else." "Not if someone rides ahead and explains what happened, tells them you'll be there as soon as you're able to travel." Kade set down his coffee cup, made a decision. "I'll go. I know the superintendent in Steins Pass, old friend of my father's. I'll tell him what happened, make sure they hold your position." Ruby stared at him. "Why would you do that? You've already saved my life. You don't owe me anything else." "Maybe I want to," Kade said, and the words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning neither of them was quite ready to examine. Martha bustled back in then, saving them both from the suddenly charged atmosphere, carrying a tray with bread and cheese and dried apples. "You both need to eat," she announced. "Can't go rescuing people and nearly drowning on empty stomachs. And you, young lady, are staying here until that ankle heals properly. I won't hear any arguments about it." Ruby opened her mouth to protest, caught the look in Martha's eye, and wisely closed it again. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Henderson. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "Repay me by being more careful around rivers," Martha said tartly, but her eyes were kind. "And by letting yourself heal. Kade's right about riding to Steins Pass. It's the sensible thing to do." They ate together, the three of them, and Kade found himself watching Ruby. The way she moved, the way she talked with her hands when she got excited about something, the way she laughed at Martha's stories about life on the ranch. She was smart and funny and clearly educated, but there was a toughness to her too, a resilience that he suspected she didn't even know she had. When the meal was finished, Kade stood, stretched. I should get going if I want to make Stein's Pass before dark. It's a hard ride from here. You'll do no such thing, Martha said firmly. You'll rest for a few hours first. You nearly drowned too, remember? And your clothes are still wet. Give them time to dry, give yourself time to recover, and then you can ride out. Stein's Pass will still be there in the morning. Kade wanted to argue, but Martha Henderson was a force of nature when she'd made up her mind about something. And besides, he was more tired than he wanted to admit. The adrenaline from the rescue had worn off, leaving him drained and shaky. Yes, madam, he said, because arguing with Martha was like arguing with the desert wind. Pointless and exhausting. Martha showed him to a small room off the kitchen, little more than a storage space with a cot in it, but the blankets were clean and the room was warm from its proximity to the fire. Kade lay down, thinking he'd just rest his eyes for a few minutes, and promptly fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When he woke, the light slanting through the small window told him it was late afternoon. He could hear voices from the main room, Martha and Ruby talking, and another voice he recognized as Tom Henderson's. Kade sat up, rubbed his face, and went to join them. Tom stood when he came in, shook his hand firmly. Martha told me what you did. That was a brave thing, son. Foolish, maybe, but brave. Couldn't let her drown, Kade said simply. No, I suppose you couldn't. Tom glanced at Ruby, who was still wrapped in her quilt by the fire, her ankle still propped up. Martha says you're riding to Stein's Pass to explain the situation to the school board. That's right. I know Jacob Morrison, the superintendent. He'll understand. Then you'll want to leave soon, beat the darkness. The road to Stein's Pass isn't safe to travel at night. Too many bandits working that stretch, preying on miners coming from the camps. Tom went to a cabinet, pulled out a gun belt with a well-maintained Colt revolver. Take this, just in case. Kade started to refuse, but Tom pressed the gun belt into his hands. I insist. You're doing a good thing here, helping Miss Ford. Let me help you stay safe while you do it. Kade buckled on the gun belt, checked the Colt to make sure it was loaded. I'll bring it back when I return. When will that be? Ruby asked, and there was something in her voice, some note of concern that made Kade's heart skip. 3 days, maybe 4. I'll talk to Morrison, make sure your position is secure, then ride back here. By then you should be well enough to travel and I can escort you to Stein's Pass myself. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to, I want to. Kade crossed to where she sat, crouched down so they were at eye level. Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't try to cross any more rivers alone. Ruby laughed, reached out and touched his hand where it rested on his knee. Thank you, Kade, for everything. I know I keep saying it, but I mean it. You saved my life today. And maybe you'll return the favor someday, Kade said lightly, trying to ignore the way his skin burned where she touched him. Life's long, never know what might happen. He stood, said his goodbyes to Martha and Tom, gathered his now dry clothes and his few belongings, and headed out to where his mare was waiting, refreshed and fed and ready to travel. As he swung into the saddle, he looked back at the house and saw Ruby standing in the doorway, wrapped in her quilt, watching him go. He raised his hand in farewell, and she raised hers in return, and then he turned his horse toward the southwest and rode hard for Stein's Pass. The ride took him through some of the most beautiful and brutal country in New Mexico territory. Desert stretched out in all directions, broken only by mesas and mountains rising in the distance. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Kade was grateful for his hat and the water he'd filled before leaving the Henderson ranch. He passed a few other travelers on the road, miners mostly, heading east with their pockets full of silver or copper or dreams of the same. They eyed him warily, and he kept his hand near the borrowed colt, but no one bothered him. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of orange and gold and purple, Stein's Pass came into view, a rough collection of buildings clustered around the pass between two mountain ranges. It had started as a way station on the Butterfield Overland Mail route, but the discovery of silver in the nearby hills had turned it into a boom town practically overnight. Now it was home to maybe 300 people, most of them men, most of them looking to strike it rich. Kade rode into town as darkness fell, the saloons already lit up and ringing with piano music and laughter. He bypassed them all, headed straight for the small house on the edge of town where Jacob Morrison lived with his wife and 3 children. Jacob answered the door himself, a tall, thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers. His face broke into a surprised smile when he saw Kade. "Kade Lancaster, I haven't seen you in months. What brings you to Stein's Pass?" "I need to talk to you about your new teacher, Ruby Ford," Kade said. "Can I come in?" Jacob's smile faded, replaced by concern. "Of course, come in. Is something wrong? She was supposed to arrive 3 days ago, but we haven't heard anything." Kade stepped inside, removed his hat. Jacob's wife, Ellen, appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, and Jacob quickly introduced them. Then Kade told them what had happened, about finding Ruby trying to cross the Rio Grande, about pulling her from the water, about her twisted ankle and her current recovery at the Henderson Ranch. "My God," Ellen breathed when he finished. "She could have died." "She nearly did," Kade said grimly. "But she's all right now, just needs a few days to heal. I told her I'd ride ahead, make sure you knew what happened, make sure you'd hold her position." "Of course we will," Jacob said immediately. "We're lucky she still wants to come after an ordeal like that." Most people would have gotten on the first stage back to wherever they came from. "Ruby's not most people," Kade said, and realized as he said it how true it was, how much he'd come to understand about her in just a few short hours. Ellen was watching him with a knowing look in her eyes. "You care about her." It wasn't a question, but Kade answered anyway. "I barely know her, but yes, I suppose I do. She's brave, strong, smart. She deserves a chance to make a new life out here if that's what she wants." "Then we'll make sure she has that chance," Jacob said. "You'll stay the night here, of course. We have a spare room. And tomorrow you can tell us more about this Ruby Ford who's captured your attention so completely." Kade felt his face heat but didn't deny it. There didn't seem to be much point. He spent the night in the Morrison's spare room, a small but comfortable space that smelled of lavender and beeswax. Despite his exhaustion, he had trouble sleeping, his mind full of images of Ruby, her red hair streaming in the water, her green eyes looking up at him with gratitude and something else, something he didn't quite dare name. In the morning, Ellen fed him a breakfast big enough for 3 men, and Jacob walked with him down to the schoolhouse, a small adobe building with a bell tower and windows that let in the morning light. Inside, it was sparse but clean, with rows of benches for the students and a desk at the front for the teacher. "We have about 20 students," Jacob explained, ages ranging from 6 to 14. Most of them are children of miners, but we also have a few ranchers' kids who ride in from the surrounding area. It's not an easy job, teaching here. The children are bright but rough around the edges, and some of the parents don't see much value in education. But Ruby's letter of application was so impressive, her references so strong, that we had no hesitation in offering her the position. "She'll do well here," Kade said with certainty. "She's not afraid of challenges." Jacob smiled. "You really do care about her." "I can see it in your eyes when you talk about her." Cade looked away out the window at the dusty street. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who's been in love himself, Jacob said gently. I recognize the signs. The question is, what are you going to do about it? I don't know. I only met her yesterday. It seems impossible to feel this much this fast. Love doesn't follow a schedule, Cade. It happens when it happens. Your father knew that. He fell in love with your mother the moment he saw her, used to tell me so all the time. Said it was like being struck by lightning. Sudden and powerful and impossible to ignore. Cade remembered his father saying something similar. Remembered the way his parents had looked at each other even after 20 years of marriage, like they were the only two people in the world. He'd always wanted that for himself, that kind of love, that kind of certainty. He just never expected to find it in the muddy waters of the Rio Grande. I should get back, he said. Make sure she's all right, help her get here safely. You do that, Jacob said. And Cade. Bring her by when you arrive. Ellen and I would like to meet this remarkable woman properly. Cade shook his hand, thanked him for his hospitality, and rode out of Stein's Pass with the sun climbing into another brilliant blue sky. The journey back to the Henderson ranch seemed to take forever, even though he pushed his mare as hard as he dared. He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to get back to Ruby, needed to make sure she was all right, needed to see her smile and hear her laugh and convince himself that the connection he'd felt between them was real and not just a product of heightened emotions and near-death experiences. He arrived at the Henderson ranch just as the sun was setting on his second day of travel, his mare lathered and tired, and he himself saddle-sore and dusty. Martha came out to meet him, wiping her hands on her apron. She's been watching for you all day, Martha said without preamble. Wouldn't admit it, of course, but I could tell. Every time a horse went by on the road, she'd look up, and when it wasn't you, she'd go back to her mending with this disappointed little sigh. Cade felt something warm bloom in his chest. How's her ankle? Much better. Still tender, but the swelling's gone down. She can walk on it now, though I wouldn't recommend long distances yet. Martha studied him, her expression softening. You rode hard to get back here. I told her 3 or 4 days, didn't want her to worry. Martha said, clearly not believing that was the only reason. She's inside, helping with supper. Go on in and wash up. You look like you've been dragged behind your horse half the way here. Cade did as he was told, splashing water from the pump over his face and hands, trying to make himself presentable. His heart was pounding as he walked to the door, pushed it open, stepped inside. Ruby was standing at the stove, stirring something in a pot, and when she heard the door, she turned around. Her face lit up when she saw him, her whole expression transforming, and Cade felt that lightning strike Jacob had mentioned, that sudden powerful certainty. You're back, she said, and her voice was warm with genuine happiness. I was starting to worry. Told you 3 or 4 days, Cade said, pulling off his hat, suddenly shy. How's the ankle? See for yourself, Ruby said, and walked toward him, only the slightest hitch in her gait. Mrs. Henderson's been taking good care of me. I'm almost as good as new. That's good. That's real good. Cade realized he was staring, realized he was standing in the doorway like a fool with his hat in his hands, but he couldn't seem to make himself move. Ruby closed the distance between them, reached out and took his hand. Her touch was warm and real and sent electricity racing up his arm. Thank you for going to Stein's Pass, for making sure I still have a position. Martha told me you probably rode through the night to get there and back so quickly. I wanted to make sure you didn't worry, Cade said, which was true if not the whole truth. Well, I did worry anyway, Ruby said softly. I worried that you might not come back, that I might not see you again. I came back, Cade said, and turned his hand to lace his fingers through hers. I'll always come back. The words hung between them, heavy with promise, and Ruby smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and made her whole face glow. "Good," she said, "because I'd like to see you again. After Stein's Pass, I mean, if you want to." "I want to," Kade said. And then, because he couldn't help himself, because she was standing so close and looking up at him with those green eyes and he'd been thinking about her for 2 days straight, he leaned down and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tentative, asking permission as much as taking it. Ruby made a small, surprised sound, then leaned into him, kissed him back with a sweetness that made his head spin. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard, and Kade rested his forehead against hers, his heart hammering so loud he was sure she could hear it. "I know this is fast," he said quietly. "I know we barely know each other, but I've never felt like this before, Ruby. Never felt this certain about anything." "I know," Ruby whispered. "I feel it too. It's like the river brought us together for a reason. Like I was supposed to get lost, supposed to try to cross at that exact spot, supposed to meet you." "Fate," Kade said, testing the word. "Maybe," Ruby said, smiling against his lips. "Or maybe just extraordinary luck. They might have stayed like that, wrapped up in each other, if Tom hadn't cleared his throat from the doorway, announcing his arrival." They sprang apart, both blushing, and Tom fought back a smile. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "But Martha sent me to tell you supper's ready." They ate together, the four of them, and the conversation flowed easily. Ruby told them about Boston, about her work at a school there before her father had started pressuring her to marry. Kade told her about his ranch, a small spread about 15 miles east of San Marshall where he raised horses and a few head of cattle. Tom and Martha shared stories about their years in New Mexico, about the changes they'd seen, the people they'd met. After supper, Kade and Ruby walked outside together, ostensibly so Ruby could test her ankle on the uneven ground, but really just to be alone. The moon was nearly full, painting the desert in silver light, and the air was cool and clean. "Tell me about your ranch," Ruby said as they walked slowly around the yard. "What's it like?" "It's not much," Kade admitted. "Just a small house and a barn, some corrals, but the land is good and there's a creek that runs through the property year-round. I've been building up a herd of horses, selling them to the army and to ranchers who need good working stock. It's a hard life, but it's honest work and it's mine." "It sounds wonderful," Ruby said wistfully. "I've never had anything that was truly mine. My father controlled everything back in Boston, even the money I earned from teaching. He said women couldn't be trusted with finances." "Your father sounds like a piece of work," Kade said bluntly. Ruby laughed. "That's putting it kindly. But I'm free of him now, or I will be once I start teaching in Stein's Pass. I'll have my own money, my own life. I can make my own choices." "And is this a choice you want to make?" Kade asked, stopping, turning to face her. "This thing between us?" "Because if it's too fast, if you need time, I understand. I can wait." Ruby reached up, cupped his face in her hand. "I don't want to wait. I've spent my whole life waiting, being careful, doing what other people expected of me. For once, I want to do something reckless, something just for me. And right now, what I want is you." Kade kissed her again, deeper this time, wrapping his arms around her and pulling her close. She fit against him perfectly, her curves pressing against his chest, her hands sliding up to tangle in his hair. When they finally broke apart, they were both trembling. "Come to Stein's Pass with me," Ruby said breathlessly. "Not just to escort me there, but to stay, to court me properly, to see if this feeling between us is real or just the aftermath of a crisis." "It's real," Kade said with absolute certainty. "But yes, I'll come with you. I'll court you properly, do this right." They stayed outside until the cold drove them back in, talking and kissing and making plans. Kade would escort Ruby to Stein's Pass in 2 days, once her ankle was fully healed. He'd help her get settled, introduce her to people, make sure she was safe. And then he'd visit as often as he could, make the trip from his ranch to see her, until they both knew for certain what their future held. When they finally went inside, Martha took one look at their faces and smiled. "Well, it's about time," she said. "I was starting to think you two were going to dance around each other forever." "We're not dancing anymore," Ruby said, her hand finding Kade's and holding tight. "We're diving in head first, just like he did in the river." "Sometimes that's the only way to do it," Martha agreed. "Just make sure you both come up for air once in a while." The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation and stolen moments. Martha helped Ruby alter one of her old dresses to fit Ruby's slimmer frame, and Tom found a pair of boots that were only slightly too big. Kade helped around the ranch, fixing a fence that had come loose and mucking out the stalls. But mostly, he just wanted to be near Ruby, to talk to her, to learn everything about her. He discovered that she loved poetry but hated Shakespeare, that she could play the piano but couldn't carry a tune, that she was afraid of snakes but fascinated by thunderstorms. She discovered that he'd taught himself to read from his mother's Bible, that he could gentle the wildest horse but couldn't dance to save his life, that he'd once wanted to be a lawyer but had given up that dream when his father died and left him the ranch. They talked about everything and nothing, their conversations ranging from the profound to the absurd, and with every word, every shared story, every laugh, Kade fell deeper in love with her. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely unlike anything he'd ever experienced. On the morning of the 3rd day, they said goodbye to Tom and Martha, thanking them profusely for their kindness and hospitality. Martha hugged them both, made them promise to visit, and pressed a package of food into Ruby's hands for the journey. "You take care of each other," she said, her eyes suspiciously bright. "And Ruby, you write to me and let me know how you're settling in Stein's Pass." "I will," Ruby promised, hugging her back. "Thank you for everything, Martha. I don't know what I would have done without you." "You'd have managed," Martha said firmly. "You're stronger than you know, girl, but I'm glad you didn't have to manage alone." Kade helped Ruby up onto his mare, then swung up behind her, settling her against his chest just like he had 3 days ago. But everything was different now, charged with new meaning, weighted with possibility and promise. They rode out with the sun rising behind them, painting the desert in shades of pink and gold. Ruby leaned back against Kade, her head resting on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her waist, holding her secure. "Are you nervous?" he asked as they rode. "About teaching, I mean." "Terrified," Ruby admitted, "but excited too. I've been teaching since I was 18, but never somewhere like this, never somewhere so wild and different. It feels like an adventure." "It is an adventure," Kade agreed. "New Mexico's not like anywhere else. It can be harsh and unforgiving, but it's also beautiful and full of possibility. It's a place where people can reinvent themselves, start fresh." "Is that what you did? Reinvent yourself?" Kade considered the question. "I suppose so. When my father died, I had a choice. I could sell the ranch, go back east, try to pursue that law degree. Or I could stay, build something here, make a life in a place that felt like home. I chose to stay, and I've never regretted it." "I'm glad you stayed," Ruby said softly. "If you hadn't, you wouldn't have been there by the river that day." "Everything happens for a reason," Kade said, and kissed the top of her head. They rode through the morning, following the road southwest toward Stein's Pass. The landscape changed gradually, becoming more mountainous, the vegetation shifting from desert scrub to juniper and pine at the higher elevations. They passed other travelers, miners and merchants and families in wagons, all heading somewhere, all chasing their own dreams. Around midday, they stopped to rest and water the horse at a small creek. Ruby walked around, testing her ankle, and declared it felt almost normal. They ate some of the food Martha had packed, cold biscuits and cheese and dried fruit, and talked about what Ruby's house in Steins Pass would be like. Jacob Morrison mentioned in his letter that the school provides housing for the teacher, Ruby said. A small house near the schoolhouse. I'm hoping it has a real stove and not just a fireplace, and a decent bed. I'm tired of sleeping on the ground. I'm sure it will be fine, Kade said. Jacob's a good man. He'll make sure you have everything you need. What about you? Ruby asked, turning to look at him. Where will you stay when you visit? There's a boarding house in town. Mrs. Chen runs it, a widow from San Francisco. She's got clean rooms and doesn't ask too many questions. I've stayed there before when I had business in Steins Pass. Ruby was quiet for a moment, then said carefully, People are going to talk, about us. About a single woman and a single man courting. Some of them won't approve. Let them talk, Kade said firmly. I don't care what anyone thinks as long as you're happy. I am happy, Ruby said, smiling at him. Happier than I've been in a long time, maybe ever. They reached Steins Pass as the sun was beginning to set, the town coming to life as the miners returned from their claims and the saloons opened their doors. Kade rode straight to Jacob Morrison's house, helped Ruby down from the horse, and knocked on the door. Ellen Morrison answered, her face breaking into a warm smile when she saw them. You must be Ruby. Jacob told me all about you. Please come in, both of you. Jacob appeared behind his wife, shook hands with Kade, and greeted Ruby warmly. I'm so glad you're all right, Miss Ford. Kade told us about your accident. It must have been terrifying. It was, Ruby admitted. But Kade saved my life and the Hendersons took wonderful care of me. I'm just sorry I'm late arriving. Don't give it another thought, Jacob said. We're just grateful you still want to teach here after such an ordeal. Now, let me show you to your house. It's just down the street, very close to the schoolhouse. The teacher's house was small but charming. A single-room adobe structure with a real wooden floor and a pot-bellied stove for heat and cooking. There was a narrow bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, and several shelves for books and supplies. A door in the back led to a small enclosed yard with a privy and a place to hang laundry. It's perfect, Ruby said, her eyes shining as she looked around. Absolutely perfect. I'm glad you think so, Ellen said. I've stocked the shelves with some basic supplies to get you started, and there's firewood out back. If you need anything else, just let us know. They talked for a while longer, Jacob explaining the school schedule and introducing Ruby to some of her responsibilities. Then Kade and Ruby were alone, standing in the small house that would be Ruby's home. What do you think? Ruby asked, turning in a slow circle. Really think, I mean. I think you're going to be happy here, Kade said honestly. I think you're going to make a real difference in these kids' lives. Ruby crossed to him, wrapped her arms around his waist and rested her head on his chest. I couldn't have done this without you. You know that, right? If you hadn't pulled me out of that river, I'd be dead. And even if I'd survived, if you hadn't gone to Jacob, hadn't escorted me here, I never would have made it. You would have found a way, Kade said, holding her close. You're the strongest person I've ever met, Ruby Ford, but I'm glad I could help. I'm glad I was there. They stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other, and then Ruby pulled back, looked up at him. Stay in town for a few days, she said. Help me settle in. I want to spend more time with you before you have to go back to your ranch. I can do that, Kade said, even though he knew it meant leaving his horses unattended for longer than he'd planned. He had a hired hand who could manage for a week or so, and being with Ruby was worth any inconvenience. Over the next few days, Kade helped Ruby prepare for the start of school. They cleaned the schoolhouse from top to bottom, scrubbing the floors and washing the windows until they gleamed. They organized books and slates and chalk, set up the benches in neat rows. Ruby made a list of supplies she'd need, and Kade helped her shop for them at the general store, where the proprietor, a cheerful man named Mr. Yates, welcomed her warmly and promised to extend her credit until she received her first month's salary. In the evenings, Kade would walk Ruby home from wherever they'd been working, and they'd sit together on the small bench outside her house, talking and watching the stars come out. Sometimes Jacob and Ellen would join them, or other townspeople who wanted to meet the new teacher. Ruby charmed everyone she met with her intelligence and warmth and quick wit, and Kade could see that she was already becoming part of the community. On Ruby's first day of teaching, Kade sat in the back of the schoolhouse, ostensibly there to help if she needed anything but really just wanting to watch her work. 23 children showed up, ranging in age from 6 to 15. Most of them scrubbed clean and dressed in their best clothes for the new teacher. Ruby stood at the front of the room, her red hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing the altered dress Martha had given her, and Kade thought she'd never looked more beautiful. She introduced herself, told the children a little about where she was from and why she'd come to Stein's Pass, and then she did something Kade hadn't expected. "I know some of you might be wondering about the new teacher from back east," she said, her voice clear and confident. "Wondering if I'll understand what life is like out here, if I'll be able to teach you anything useful. And the truth is, I have a lot to learn about New Mexico and about your lives. So I propose we teach each other. You teach me about this place, about the plants and animals and how to survive in the desert, and I'll teach you reading and writing and arithmetic and history. We'll learn together. Does that sound fair?" The children looked at each other. Then one by one they nodded, and Kade saw several of them relax, saw the wariness leave their eyes. Ruby had won them over in less than 5 minutes, and he fell in love with her all over again. The school day passed smoothly, with Ruby dividing the children into groups based on their ability levels and moving between them, helping each one progress at their own pace. She was patient and encouraging, never talking down to the children but treating them with respect, and they responded by working hard and asking questions and clearly enjoying themselves. When the last student left, Ruby collapsed onto the bench behind her desk, looking exhausted but happy. Kade crossed to her, handed her a cup of water he'd fetched from the well. "You were amazing," he said. "Those kids love you already." "They're wonderful," Ruby said, drinking the water gratefully. "Smart and curious and so eager to learn. I think I'm going to love teaching here." "I think you will too," Kade agreed. "But I should probably head back to my ranch tomorrow. I've been gone almost a week and I need to check on things, make sure my hired hand hasn't run off with my horses." Ruby's face fell. "Tomorrow? So soon?" "I don't want to go," Kade said, taking her hands. "But I have responsibilities, animals that depend on me, but I'll come back in 2 weeks, I promise, and I'll write to you in between." "I'll write back," Ruby promised. "Every day if you want me to." "Every day sounds perfect," Kade said and kissed her, pouring all his feelings into it, trying to memorize the taste of her, the feel of her in his arms. That night, Kade lay awake in his room at Mrs. Chen's boarding house, staring at the ceiling and wondering how he was supposed to leave Ruby behind, even temporarily. The thought of being away from her for 2 weeks felt unbearable, but he knew it was necessary. He had a ranch to run, a livelihood to maintain. He couldn't just abandon everything, no matter how much he wanted to stay. In the morning, he met Ruby for breakfast at the Morrisons' house, where Ellen had prepared a feast. They ate together, making small talk, but Cade could see the sadness in Ruby's eyes, could feel the weight of their impending separation. After breakfast, they walked together to where his mare was tied outside Mrs. Chen's boarding house. Cade had already settled his bill and packed his few belongings, and there was nothing left to do but say goodbye. 2 weeks, Ruby said, holding his hands tight. You promise? I promise, Cade said. Nothing could keep me away. He kissed her one last time, long and deep and full of promise, and then he forced himself to let go, to swing up into the saddle, to turn his mare toward home. He looked back once and saw Ruby standing in the street, her hand raised in farewell, and he had to use every ounce of willpower he possessed to keep riding. The 2 weeks that followed were the longest of Cade's life. He threw himself into work, repairing fences and breaking green horses and checking on his cattle, anything to keep his mind off Ruby. But every night he sat down and wrote her a letter, telling her about his day, asking about hers, counting down the days until he could see her again. Ruby's letters arrived every few days, brought by the mail coach that ran between San Marshall and Steins Pass. They were long and detailed and full of life, telling him about her students, about the people she was meeting, about the challenges and joys of teaching in a frontier town. She missed him, she said in every letter, missed him terribly. But she was happy too, building a life for herself, making a difference. Cade lived for those letters, read them over and over until he had them memorized, and when the 2 weeks were finally up, he rode for Steins Pass like the devil himself was chasing him. He arrived on a Saturday evening, dusty and tired and desperate to see Ruby. He went straight to her house, knocked on the door, and when she opened it and saw him standing there, her whole face lit up with joy. "Cade!" she cried and threw herself into his arms. He caught her, held her tight, breathed in the scent of her hair, and felt something inside him settle, like a piece of himself that had been missing had finally clicked back into place. "I missed you," he said against her hair. "God, Ruby, I missed you so much." "I missed you too," she said, pulling back just enough to look at him. These 2 weeks felt like 2 years. He kissed her then, right there on her doorstep, not caring who saw, not caring about anything except the fact that she was in his arms again and everything felt right. Over the next few months, a pattern emerged. Cade would spend a week or so at his ranch, working hard and saving up tasks that could wait, and then he'd ride to Steins Pass and spend several days with Ruby. They'd walk together in the evenings, have dinner with the Morrisons or other friends Ruby had made, attend church on Sundays. Cade helped out around the schoolhouse, fixing things that broke, building new shelves, painting the walls a cheerful yellow that Ruby insisted would help the children learn better. The town accepted their courtship without much fuss. A few of the older ladies clucked their tongues and muttered about propriety, but most people seemed happy for them, seemed to understand that what they had was special and rare and worth celebrating. As winter approached, Cade began to think seriously about the future, about what he wanted and what Ruby wanted and how they could build a life together. His ranch was too far from Steins Pass for Ruby to teach and live there, but he couldn't ask her to give up her work when she so clearly loved it. They needed a solution, a way to be together without either of them sacrificing what mattered to them. He was mulling over this problem one evening in late November, sitting with Ruby by the fire in her small house, when Ruby brought it up herself. "I've been thinking," she said, setting down the shirt she'd been mending, "about us, about the future." "So have I," Cade admitted, "and I haven't come up with any good answers. I don't want to keep living like this, seeing you only a few days out of every month, but I don't know how to fix it." "What if you sold your ranch?" Ruby asked tentatively. "Or leased it to someone else? There are plenty of people in Steins Pass who need work done who'd pay for a good horseman or ranch hand. You could live here, be with me all the time. Kade's first instinct was to refuse, to say that the ranch was his heritage, his father's legacy, something he couldn't give up. But then he looked at Ruby, at the hope and love in her eyes, and he realized that his father would understand, would want him to choose love over land. "I could do that," he said slowly. "The ranch isn't much, but I could probably sell it for enough to buy a small place here in town, somewhere we could live after we're married. If you'll have me, that is." Ruby stared at him. "Is that a proposal?" "It's the worst proposal in the history of proposals," Kade said, laughing at himself. "I don't even have a ring. But yes, Ruby Ford, I'm asking you to marry me. I love you. I've loved you since I pulled you out of that river, maybe even before that, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Ruby launched herself at him, knocking him backward on the small settee, kissing him with such enthusiasm that they both ended up on the floor, laughing and tangled together. "Yes," she said when they finally came up for air. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." "I love you too, Kade Lancaster. I'll marry you tomorrow if you want." "Let's give it at least a few weeks," Kade said, grinning. "I want to do this right. Court you properly, get a ring, ask Jacob Morrison for permission since he's the closest thing you have to family out here." "Jacob will be thrilled," Ruby said. "Ellen's been hinting for months that we should get married. She says we're obviously mad about each other and there's no point in waiting." They spent the rest of the evening making plans, giddy with happiness and possibility. They'd get married in the spring, they decided, after the school year ended. That would give Kade time to sell his ranch, give Ruby time to finish out her first year of teaching successfully. They'd have a simple ceremony, just friends and neighbors, and then they'd build a life together in Steins Pass, true to his word. Kade rode back to his ranch the next day and put out word that he was looking to sell. Within a month, he had a buyer, a young couple newly arrived from Missouri with dreams of starting fresh in New Mexico. The price they offered was fair, enough for Kade to buy a small house on the edge of Steins Pass, and still have money left over to invest in a horse trading business he was thinking of starting. He used some of that money to buy Ruby a ring, a simple gold band with a small ruby set in it, red like her hair. When he gave it to her on Christmas Day, surrounded by the Morrisons and half the town at the church social, she cried and laughed at the same time and kissed him in front of everyone. The winter passed slowly, with Kade now living permanently in Steins Pass and helping out wherever he was needed. He took on odd jobs, broke horses for the local ranchers, helped build a new addition onto the saloon. He was good with his hands and a hard worker, and people quickly learned they could count on him. Ruby continued teaching, and Kade continued to be amazed by her dedication and skill. She'd started a lending library in the schoolhouse, collecting books from anyone who had them to spare and allowing students and their families to borrow them. She'd organized a Christmas pageant that the whole town attended, where her students performed songs and recitations that left many of the rough miners in tears. She was making a real difference, and Kade was so proud of her he thought he might burst. In March, Kade bought a small house on the outskirts of town, a 2-room adobe structure with a front porch and a yard big enough for a vegetable garden and maybe some chickens. He spent his free time fixing it up, repairing the roof and building new furniture, making it into a home for himself and Ruby. Ruby helped when she could, offering opinions on paint colors and curtain fabric, and together they transformed the little house into something warm and welcoming. Kade built them a real bed frame with his own hands, wide enough for 2 and sturdy enough to last a lifetime. Ruby sewed curtains from fabric Ellen Morrison helped her pick out at the general store, cheerful yellow cotton that matched the schoolhouse walls. As spring arrived and the desert bloomed with wildflowers, they set a date for the wedding. The last Saturday in May, just after the school year ended. Jacob Morrison would perform the ceremony, and Ellen would help Ruby with her dress. The whole town was invited, and from the way people were talking, the whole town planned to attend. Ruby had written to her family back in Boston, informing them of her engagement. Her mother had written back a brief, cold letter congratulating her, and saying she hoped Ruby knew what she was doing. Her father hadn't written at all. Ruby had been hurt by their response, but Kade held her while she cried and reminded her that she had a new family now, here in New Mexico, people who loved her and supported her. The week before the wedding, Kade's hired hand from the ranch, a good-natured young man named Pete, arrived in Steins Pass with Kade's favorite horse, a bay gelding named Copper, as a wedding gift. The new owners of the ranch had sent along a note saying they knew how much Kade had loved that particular horse and wanted him to have it. Kade was touched by the gesture, and on his wedding day he rode Copper to the church, the horse's coat gleaming in the morning sun, ribbons braided into his mane by some of Ruby's students who'd insisted on helping. The church was packed with people, miners and ranchers and shopkeepers and families, all dressed in their Sunday best. Ellen Morrison had outdone herself decorating the simple building with wildflowers and candles, and the result was beautiful, simple and elegant and perfect. Kade stood at the front of the church with Jacob, his heart pounding, watching the door. And then Ruby appeared, and his heart stopped altogether. She wore a simple white dress that Ellen had helped her make, with lace at the collar and cuffs, her red hair loose around her shoulders the way Kade loved it, crowned with a wreath of wildflowers. She carried a bouquet of desert marigolds and Indian paintbrush, and she was the most beautiful thing Kade had ever seen. She walked down the aisle alone, head held high, and when she reached Kade, she took his hand and smiled up at him with such love and joy that he had to blink back tears. Jacob performed the ceremony, his voice warm and sure, and when it came time for the vows, Kade spoke from his heart. "Ruby, I promise to love you and cherish you for all the days of my life. I promise to support your dreams and celebrate your victories and comfort you in your sorrows. I promise to be your partner, your friend, your home. From the moment I pulled you from that river, I knew you were meant to be part of my life, and I thank God every day that I was in the right place at the right time to save you. You saved me right back, you know. You gave me a reason to believe in love, in fate, in the possibility of happiness. I love you, Ruby Ford, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." Ruby was crying by the time he finished, happy tears that streamed down her face as she spoke her own vows. "Kade, I promise to love you with everything I am. I promise to build a life with you, to make a home with you, to face whatever challenges come our way together. You saved my life that day in the river, but you did more than that. You gave me a new life, a better life, a life full of love and purpose and joy. I was lost before I met you in more ways than one, and you helped me find my way. I love you, Kade Lancaster, and I will spend the rest of my life showing you how grateful I am that you dove into that river after me." Jacob pronounced them man and wife, and Kade kissed his bride as the church erupted in cheers and applause. They walked back down the aisle hand in hand, beaming at their friends and neighbors, and out into the bright New Mexico sunshine. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with tables of food set up in the street, a fiddler playing dancing music, and enough whiskey and beer to float a boat. Kade danced with Ruby until they were both breathless and laughing, and then they danced some more. As the stars came out and the party began to wind down, Cade and Ruby slipped away to their little house on the edge of town. Someone had decorated it with more wildflowers and left candles burning in the windows, and when they stepped inside, it felt like stepping into their future, their life together, everything they'd been working toward. Cade carried Ruby over the threshold, kissed her deeply, and set her gently on her feet. They stood in their house, their home, and looked at each other with wonder and love and anticipation. "Hello, Mrs. Lancaster," Cade said softly. "Hello, Mr. Lancaster," Ruby replied, smiling. "Take me to bed." And he did, carrying her to the bed he'd built with his own hands, and they made love for the first time as husband and wife, gentle and sweet and full of promise. Afterward, they lay tangled together, talking softly about their plans for the future, about the life they'd build together. "I want children," Ruby said, tracing patterns on his chest. "Lots of them, a whole houseful." "How many is a houseful?" Cade asked, amused. "I don't know, 4 or 5. Enough that we'll never be lonely, that our house is always full of laughter." "I can do 4 or 5, Cade said, "though we might need a bigger house eventually." "We'll build one," Ruby said confidently. "We can do anything together, you and me," and she was right. Over the years that followed, they built a life that was rich and full and happy. Ruby continued teaching, becoming a beloved figure in Stein's Pass, the teacher who shaped a generation of children and gave them the tools to build better lives. Cade's horse trading business grew and prospered, and he became known throughout the territory as a man with an eye for good horseflesh and a reputation for honest dealing. They had 4 children, just as Ruby had wanted. 3 boys and a girl, all of them with their mother's red hair and their father's steady temperament. The boys grew up to be ranchers and lawmen and businessmen, good men who treated women with respect and worked hard and believed in doing right. The girl became a teacher like her mother, carrying on Ruby's legacy of education and empowerment. Cade and Ruby added rooms to their house as their family grew, until the simple 2-room adobe had become a sprawling home with a big kitchen and a parlor and bedrooms for everyone. They planted trees in the yard, cottonwoods and fruit trees that provided shade and beauty, and a place for the children to climb. On warm evenings, they'd sit on their porch and watch the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold, and Cade would think about that day by the river, about how a moment of crisis had changed both their lives forever. He'd think about how easily things could have gone differently, how Ruby could have drowned, how he might never have met her, how his life would have been so much emptier without her in it. "What are you thinking about?" Ruby would ask, because she always knew when his mind was wandering. "Just how lucky I am," Cade would say. "How blessed." "We both are," Ruby would reply, taking his hand. "That river brought us together for a reason." As the years passed and their children grew and had children of their own, Cade and Ruby remained as devoted to each other as they'd been on their wedding day. They grew old together, their faces lined and their hair silver, but their love never dimmed, never faded. When they were both well into their 60s, their children and grandchildren gathered at their house for a celebration of their 40th wedding anniversary. It was a warm spring day, much like the day they'd married, and the yard was full of people and laughter and love. One of their grandchildren, a bright-eyed girl of about 8 with her grandmother's red hair, climbed into Cade's lap and asked him to tell the story again, the story of how he and Grandma Ruby had met. Cade looked over at Ruby, who was holding one of their newest grandchildren and laughing at something their oldest son had said, and smiled. "Well," he began, "it was a spring day in 1878, and I was watering my horse by the Rio Grande, when I saw the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen trying to cross at the most dangerous point in the river." Ruby looked up, caught his eye, and smiled back at him, that same smile that had captured his heart 40 years ago. And Kade knew, with absolute certainty, that diving into that river to save her had been the best decision he'd ever made, the moment that had set him on the path to everything good in his life. Their story became a legend in Stein's Pass, told and retold by their children and grandchildren, and eventually by people who'd never even met them. The tale of the cowboy who dove into the Rio Grande like a bullet to save a drowning woman, who fought the current for her, who fell in love with her before he even knew her name. The tale of the teacher from Boston who was brave enough to start over in a wild frontier town, who built a life and a legacy that lasted generations. But for Kade and Ruby, it was never just a story. It was their life, their love, their truth. They'd found each other in the most unlikely way, in a moment of crisis and chaos, and they'd built something beautiful and lasting from those frightening, desperate moments in the churning water. In their final years, when Kade's joints ached and Ruby's eyes weren't what they used to be, they'd still sit on their porch together, holding hands and watching the sunset. And sometimes Ruby would lean her head on Kade's shoulder and whisper, "Thank you for saving me." And Kade would kiss the top of her head and whisper back, "Thank you for letting me." Kade passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, with Ruby holding his hand and their children gathered around his bed. Ruby followed him just 6 months later, her heart simply giving out one morning as she sat in her favorite chair, looking out at the mountains she'd come to love. They were buried side by side in the Stein's Pass cemetery, under a shared headstone that read simply, "Kade and Ruby Lancaster. Together forever." Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren continued their legacy, living the values they'd instilled, carrying on their traditions, telling their story to each new generation. And sometimes, on warm spring days when the Rio Grande runs high with snowmelt, people in New Mexico still talk about the cowboy who loved a woman enough to dive into a raging river to save her, who built a life with her that was full of love and laughter and purpose. They talk about how one moment of courage, one act of selfless bravery, can change everything, can create ripples that spread out far beyond what anyone could imagine. Because Ruby was already under when the cowboy hit the water like a bullet and fought the current for her, and in saving her life, he found his own. And together, they proved that love can bloom in the most unexpected places, that fate sometimes brings people together in extraordinary ways, and that the best love stories are the ones where two people save each other, over and over again, every single day for the rest of their lives. Their house still stands on the edge of Stein's Pass, now owned by one of their great-grandchildren, who has carefully preserved it as a reminder of the love story that started with a rescue and grew into a legacy. The cottonwood trees Kade and Ruby planted have grown tall and strong, providing shade for yet another generation of children who play in the yard and listen to stories about their brave, loving ancestors. The little schoolhouse where Ruby taught has been converted into a museum, celebrating the history of education in Stein's Pass, and honoring the woman who dedicated her life to teaching children on the frontier. Her original desk is still there, along with some of the books from her lending library and photographs of her with various classes over the years. Every year on the anniversary of Kade and Ruby's wedding, the town holds a celebration in their honor, with dancing and food and the retelling of their story. Young couples come to lay flowers on their grave, hoping that some of that legendary love will rub off on their own relationships. The current running through that celebration is the same current that ran through Kade and Ruby's entire life together, the current of devotion, partnership, and enduring love. And if you stand by the Rio Grande on a spring morning when the water runs high and wild, some people say you can still feel the echo of that moment when a cowboy saw a woman in trouble and didn't hesitate, didn't think about the danger, just dove in with his whole heart because it was the right thing to do, because she needed saving, because some connections are forged in crisis and tempered by time into something unbreakable. That's how love stories are supposed to be, the old-timers in Stein's Pass will tell you. Not safe or predictable or easy, but brave and wild and worth fighting for. Just like Kade fighting that current for Ruby. Just like Ruby choosing to stay in New Mexico instead of running back to the safety of Boston. Just like both of them choosing each other every single day for 40 years. Their story reminds us that sometimes the best things in life come from the most terrifying moments. That courage can look like jumping into a river, or starting over in a strange place, or opening your heart to someone you barely know. It reminds us that love doesn't follow a timeline or a schedule, that sometimes you just know, and when you know, you hold on tight and don't let go. The Lancaster family still gathers every year for reunions, dozens of descendants coming from all over the country to reconnect and remember where they came from. They share stories about Kade and Ruby, each generation adding their own memories and perspectives, keeping the story alive and fresh and relevant. And always, at some point during these gatherings, someone will raise a glass and offer the traditional Lancaster toast to the river that brought them together and to the love that kept them together. May we all be so lucky. Because in the end, that's what Kade and Ruby's story is really about. Luck and fate and choices, yes, but more than that. It's about recognizing something precious when you find it and being willing to fight for it, to work for it, to build a life around it. It's about two people who found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and decided to create something beautiful together. Ruby was already under when the cowboy hit the water like a bullet and fought the current for her. And that fight, that moment of desperate courage, became the foundation of a love story that lasted a lifetime and echoed through generations. It became proof that sometimes the best rescues are mutual, that in saving someone else you can find yourself saved in return, and that the strongest currents are the ones that run between two hearts that have chosen each other against all odds. Their legacy lives on not just in their descendants but in the values they embodied and the example they set. Work hard, love deeply, be brave when it matters, choose each other again and again through everything life throws at you, build something that lasts, make a difference. Leave the world better than you found it. And maybe, just maybe, be willing to jump into the river when someone needs saving, because you never know where that moment of courage might lead. For Kade Lancaster, it led to 40 years of marriage to the love of his life, 4 children, 14 grandchildren, and more great-grandchildren than anyone could keep count of. It led to a life full of purpose and meaning and joy. It led to exactly where he was always meant to be. For Ruby Ford Lancaster, that moment in the river, terrifying as it was, led to freedom and independence and a career she loved. It led to a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. It led to a family she chose and built rather than one she was born into. It led to a home in the desert that felt more real and right than any mansion in Boston ever could have. Together, they created something that transcended their individual lives, something that became part of the fabric of Stein's Pass and New Mexico territory and the American West. They became a story, a legend, a reminder that love can conquer anything, even raging rivers and cultural differences and all the challenges of building a life on the frontier. And so the story endures, passed down through the years, told and retold until it becomes almost mythical. but for those who knew them, for their children and grandchildren who saw them sitting together on their porch in their golden years, still holding hands, still finishing each other's sentences, still deeply and obviously in love. There was nothing mythical about it. It was just Kade and Ruby. The cowboy and the teacher. The man who jumped into a river and the woman he saved. Two people who found each other and built a life together and loved each other until their last breaths and probably beyond. That's the story. That's the legacy. That's the truth that lives on in every Lancaster descendant, in every couple who hears their tale and decides to be a little braver in their own love, in every person who passes their grave and pauses to remember that once upon a time, in the wild west of New Mexico, a cowboy hit the water like a bullet and fought the current for a woman who was already under, and that single moment of courage changed everything. For both of them, for all of them, for everyone who came after, and that in the end is what makes a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing down through the generations. Not just what happened, but what it meant, what it created, what it left behind. Kade and Ruby left behind love. Pure, simple, enduring love. And there's nothing in this world more powerful or more precious than that.